How can the sun go out at noon? At Golgotha, the day died for 3 hours. The scene is harsh and immediate. A hill of broken rock beyond the city walls, 3 rough crosses thrust against a sky that only an hour before had been a bright, relentless dome of heat. The air tastes of dust and sweat. The scent of blood and wood smoke hangs under the sun. Pilgrims and onlookers press in, faces creased with anger or curiosity. Soldiers stand rigid in their armor. Priests whisper among themselves. On the center cross a man breathes with ragged animal sounds. Around him, grief is small and private. A mother's hand at the edge of the crowd, the steady presence of a beloved disciple, a Roman centurion whose life has been built on order and command. It is near the 9th hour, the time when the city's life should be at its brightest, when markets are full and shadows are shortest. Instead, without the weather to warn of it, the light begins to fail. At first it is a soft dimming, like a veil drawn slightly over the face of the sun. Then shadows blur and deepen. The dust seems to thicken into a visible gloom. Men shade their eyes and frown. The noise of the crowd, the jeers, the sellers, the rattle of armor, falls away to a stunned, uneasy hush. For roughly 3 hours the world narrows to the figures on those crosses and the thick dark that holds them. If this kind of biblical mystery intrigues you, tap like and subscribe to follow the series. Those 3 hours are recorded in the narratives of the 4 Gospels. Matthew reports, "From the 6th hour until the 9th hour darkness came over all the land." Matt 27:45. Mark echoes the same timing, noting darkness beginning at the 6th hour. Mark 15:33. Luke describes the darkness that came over the whole land and the sun's light failing. Luke 23:44-45. And John records Jesus' final words shortly before he dies. John 19:28-30. These passages are spare with meteorological detail. They tell us plainly and insistently that something unusual and heavy covered the land. To stand at Golgotha in that account is to be drawn into small, intimate impressions as well as cosmic signs. Mary's face is pale as she lifts her gaze to the man on the cross, her hands as if still reaching to hold him. John stands near, scarcely breathing. The soldiers' rough voices tremble in a way unfamiliar to them. The other 2 men nailed on crosses make the scene grotesquely ordinary, and at the same time unbearably human. And in the close, compressed sound of that place, the most human thing happens. The condemned man speaks. My God, why have you forsaken me?" he cries. Matt 27:46, Mark 15:34. A phrase that pulls the crowd backward into a long memory. Psalm 22 begins that same lament. Later, when weakness and thirst press in, he says, "I thirst." John 19:28. Then, with a voice that is both surrender and proclamation, "It is finished." John 19:30. Finally, lifting what remains of himself in a last breath, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Luke 23:46. At the instant of the last word, the narrative gathers 2 dramatic signs. The curtain of the temple is torn from top to bottom. Matt 27:51, Mark 15:38, Luke 23:45. And the earth itself convulses, opening fissures and shaking the bystanders with fear. The centurion, a soldier schooled to read signs of life and death, falls silent and says what astonishment forces from him, "Truly this man was the Son of God." Matt 27:54, Mark 15:39. When multiple ancient witnesses describe a darkness, and then pair it with earth-shaking and with priestly symbolism, the veil rent, the Holy of Holies laid open, the narrative is doing more than reporting a local weather anomaly. The Gospels place this darkness in a theological frame, a cosmic sign accompanying a decisive act. But the question at the heart of our title remains, what caused daylight to disappear for 3 hours? There are several ways to approach that question. Each brings evidence and objection, conviction and doubt. We will look at 5 explanations most commonly proposed: a direct act of God, a solar eclipse, an atmospheric phenomenon, literary or symbolic reporting by the evangelists, and references in ancient non-biblical sources. For each we will weigh what supports it and what troubles it. First, A supernatural act of God. The Gospel writers, especially Luke and Matthew, present the darkness as a sign, a divine accompaniment to the death of the Messiah. The darkness functions like a cosmic lament. The heavens participate in grief. The tearing of the temple veil is given a theological interpretation in the narrative itself. A barrier between God and people has been removed. From this perspective, the darkness is not merely an odd natural event. It is an intentional, providential sign meant to mark the importance and the meaning of what has happened on that hill. In favor of this view, the timing and theatricality of the events tied to the cross suggest intentionality. The Gospels do not stop to offer a meteorological report. They present the darkness as a purposeful sign within God's redemptive action. The veil tearing from top to bottom is narrated as an unmistakably divine act, not something a weather event could rip. For readers who accept the theological premises of the Gospels, a supernatural act coheres with the shape of the story. God is both judge and reconciler, and creation itself testifies. The chief objection is methodological. Invoking a direct miracle explains the event by appealing to divine agency, but it does not satisfy scientific curiosity about physical mechanisms. Those who seek a natural explanation will ask, can this darkness be accounted for in terms of meteorology or astronomy? Another difficulty is theological. Explaining the darkness as divine judgment, rather than as expressive of lament, raises difficult questions about the nature of God in relation to the suffering of Jesus. Did God turn away? The Gospel quote, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Matt 27:46, Mark 15:34. Explicitly voices abandonment, reading the darkness solely as punitive risks oversimplifying a theologically complex moment. A moment the Gospels themselves treat with solemn ambiguity. Second, solar eclipse. At first glance, the idea resonates with everyday experience. We know the sun can be put out. Eclipses have a dramatic effect on the day, plunging land into sudden dusk. However, astronomical realities make this hypothesis problematic. A solar eclipse occurs at new moon, when the moon passes between the earth and the sun and casts a shadow on parts of the earth. Passover, the time of the crucifixion, is set by a lunar calendar and is celebrated at full moon. A full moon occurs when the sun and moon are on opposite sides of the earth. In that configuration, a solar eclipse cannot happen. In short, the timing of Passover and the astronomical mechanics of eclipses make a solar eclipse on the day of crucifixion astronomically unlikely. There are additional practical objections. Total solar eclipses are dramatic but brief. In any given place, they last a few minutes at most. The biblical accounts describe darkness lasting roughly 3 hours, far longer than any solar eclipse would produce in a single locality. And a solar eclipse casts a narrow path of totality. If the darkness were due to an eclipse, it would not uniformly cover all the land as several Gospels suggest. These considerations combine to make the simple claim, it was a solar eclipse, hard to accept without substantial qualifiers. Third, an atmospheric phenomenon. This category includes heavy storm clouds, sand or dust storms, common in the region, or aerosols such as volcanic ash pushed into the atmosphere by an eruption. Such phenomena are known to darken large geographic areas for prolonged periods. A severe dust storm can choke the daylight for hours and travel across great distances, and volcanic ash, depending on the scale of the eruption and atmospheric circulation, can blot the sun for days or longer. Arguments in favor of atmospheric causes begin with plausibility. Storms and dust are routine features of the Near Eastern climate. A local or regional event could reduce light for extended periods. Unlike an eclipse, an atmospheric event could darken the entire region and last for hours. But there are problems with this hypothesis as well. The Gospels pair the darkness with earthquake and the tearing of the temple curtain. While atmospheric conditions can coincide with seismic activity, they do not explain symbolic acts like the rending of the veil. If the darkness was due to a major volcanic eruption, we might expect independent geological or historical evidence. Ash layers, reports of unusual atmospheric phenomena in other contemporary sources. To date, there is no widely accepted record of a massive volcanic event in that exact period and region tied to the crucifixion. A dust or sandstorm could be localized and episodic, leaving little geological trace. But such storms typically come with other signs: sand piled in familiar places, people describing harsh wind and grit, details which the gospel narratives do not emphasize. In short, atmospheric explanations remain possible, but are not decisively proven by the text or by corroborating material. Vibrancy, the darkness as literary or symbolic language. Ancient writers, including the gospel authors, routinely used cosmic signs to mark theological turning points. Prophetic literature often pairs the sun's darkening with divine judgment or upheaval. For instance, Joel 2:31 and other prophetic passages speak of the sun being turned to darkness as a sign of the day of the Lord. The evangelists, writing in a culture saturated with Jewish scriptural memory, may be employing such imagery to underline the theological import of Jesus' death. From this vantage, the darkness is less a meteorological report than a theological assertion. The death of the Messiah is a cataclysmic, world-shaping event, and the language of darkness communicates that. Support for this interpretation arises from literary analysis. The gospel writers select and shape events to convey theological claims. They are not modern journalists aiming for exhaustive meteorological data. Differences in wording among the Gospels can reflect distinct authorial emphases rather than discrepancies. Against a purely symbolic reading stands the fact that multiple independent sources within the New Testament include the darkness, and early Christian writers and even some non-Christian writers seem to accept that something unusual happened. A symbolic reading does not require that the evangelists invented the darkness, but it does suggest that their chief concern was theological meaning, rather than providing a polemically neutral chronicle of a weather event. Finally, ancient non-biblical reports. A handful of early historians and chroniclers are sometimes cited as attesting to darkness at the time of Jesus' death. Two names often raised are Thallus and Phlegon. Thallus, a writer from the 1st century whose works survive only in fragments quoted or discussed by later authors, is said by Julius Africanus, a 3rd century Christian writer, to have tried to explain the darkness as a solar eclipse. Phlegon, a 2nd century historian, wrote of an eclipse and an earthquake in the reign of Tiberius. These references have been used by some to bolster the claim that contemporaries of Jesus recorded an extraordinary event. Such claims must be handled with caution. The fragments we possess are second-hand, quoted mainly by Christian apologists who had an interest in corroborating gospel reports. The surviving mentions lack precise dating and context. Scholars debate whether these authors indeed referred to the same event and whether their testimony is reliable. Some may have conflated or misdated incidents. Others may have been trying to naturalize a reported miracle. In short, these ancient references are suggestive but not conclusive. They neither prove nor disprove the darkness as a natural phenomenon. They do, however, show that the event was notable enough in later memory to be discussed and debated. After weighing these 5 pathways, where does the evidence point? There are clear limits to what historical inquiry can establish with certainty. Astronomical mechanics make a solar eclipse very unlikely. Meteorological phenomena remain possible explanations, but lack unequivocal corroboration in independent contemporary records. Ancient non-biblical references are too fragmentary to settle the question. The Gospels themselves, consistent across several witnesses, insist on the darkness and place it in a theological frame, a cosmic sign accompanying the decisive act of crucifixion, and followed by the tearing of the temple veil and the centurion's confession. Why does that theological frame matter for our question? Because the Gospels are not merely recording an odd atmospheric event, they are interpreting it. They present the darkness as one of several signs that reframe the relationship between God and humanity. The veil of the temple, that heavy curtain separating the Holy of Holies from the rest of the sanctuary, is torn from top to bottom at the moment of death. In the ancient temple, the veil symbolized the separation between God's holy presence and the people. Its rending implies that the barrier has been breached, that the way into God's presence has been opened. This is no small metaphor. For an audience steeped in temple practice, it signals that the decisive act on Golgotha has implications for how human beings stand before God. The earthquake that shakes the bystanders does two things narratively. It underscores the magnitude of the event, the ground itself testifies, and it drives people to reevaluate. The Centurion's confession, "Truly this man was the Son of God," Matt 27:54, Mark 15:39, is the narrative pivot. A professional observer, schooled in life and death matters, names the truth his training had not prepared him to see. That conversion, sudden and unplanned, models the kind of recognition the evangelists expect from their readers. From a theological standpoint, then, the darkness serves as both sign and summons. It brands the crucifixion as cosmic, not merely local. It invites humility before a mystery that subverts ordinary categories. Whether one reads the darkness as a literal atmospheric event caused by dust, storm, ash, or as a direct act of God, or as a theological statement embedded in history, the text presses its readers to the weight of the moment. Death is revealing, and the world is responding. There are pastoral tensions worth noting. Some modern readers may want a neat scientific explanation. Others will prefer a theological account that does not require natural causes. But these positions are not mutually exclusive. A believer may accept the possibility that God used natural processes to signal cosmic mourning. A scholar may recognize the evangelist's theological framing without insisting the descriptions are entirely symbolic. The safest historical claim is modest. The earliest witnesses we have, the Gospel authors, assert that darkness covered the land for hours at the time of Jesus' death. The mechanisms that produced that darkness remain debated in scholarship and contested in imagination. What then can be said with confidence? And how does that shape a response to the question in our title? First, a straightforward solar eclipse is astronomically unlikely because Passover happened at or near full moon, when solar eclipses cannot occur. Second, atmospheric causes such as dust storms or localized storms are plausible in principle, but lack decisive corroboration from contemporary non-biblical records. Third, reports from later historians like Thallus and Phlegon are intriguing but fragmentary and disputed. They cannot by themselves settle the matter. Fourth, the Gospels treat the darkness as a theological sign, woven into a narrative that emphasizes judgment, lament, and the removal of barriers between God and people. The most balanced conclusion is this: the darkness at Golgotha resists simple naturalistic explanation, and the Gospel authors intend it to be read as a cosmic sign. Whether that sign is enacted by a miracle, mediated through natural processes unknown to us, or presented intentionally as symbolic language, it functions within the Gospels to direct attention away from mere method and toward meaning. In other words, the question, what caused daylight to disappear for 3 hours, is both an invitation to historical curiosity and a call to theological reflection. History can narrow the field of plausible natural causes and expose the insufficiency of some hypotheses. Theology can name what the darkness was meant to accomplish in the hearts of those who witnessed it, and in the communities shaped by its memory. That theological name has consequences. If the veil of the temple is torn in that moment, the cost of access to God is made visible. The old sacrificial order is reinterpreted in light of the cross. If the centurion confesses, the categories of insiders and outsiders are unsettled. If the heavens darken, creation itself participates in the drama of reconciliation and judgment. These are not comforting platitudes. They are summonses to attention. They call those who hear to ask not merely what happened in the sky, but what has happened between God and humanity. How might a modern listener live with this mystery? First, with humility. Ancient witnesses recorded an event that points beyond what they could fully explain. So should we allow for the limits of our knowledge? Second, with awe. The cross is an event that commands our imagination and moral seriousness. The cosmic shadow around it intensifies that demand. Third, with implication, the tearing of the veil invites us to consider access to God as a present reality shaped by the cross, not in a simplistic, ticketed way, but as the opening of a relationship that calls for repentance, trust, and transformed living. If the darkness was atmospheric, then our wonder is at how natural processes echoed a divine purpose. If it was a miracle, then the wonder is at the directness of that purpose. If it is primarily symbolic, then the evangelists have asked us to hear the cross as world-altering in the language they believed would best communicate its significance. None of these options diminishes the narrative's moral and spiritual pressure. Something decisive happened on Golgotha that day, and the cosmos itself is recorded as responding. We close where the narrative closes, with the last words and the aftermath. "It is finished" rings like a completed work that still requires reception. The earth trembles. The veil tears. The Centurion speaks. Friends depart changed. The city moves under a new shadow. The Gospels leave us in a place of unresolved tension between wonder and question. A tension that is, perhaps, precisely the point. To stand at Golgotha is to be summoned into a larger story in which human suffering, divine action, and cosmic response meet. If this account leaves you wanting to read the primary texts for yourself, return to Matthew 27:45-54, Mark 15:33-39, Luke 23:44-46, and John 19:28-30, and hear the voices again. And if you would like to explore other biblical mysteries and how history and theology wrestle with them, subscribe and share this video with someone who loves questions that both challenge the mind and awaken the heart.